distinguished professors, guests, and dear students. On behalf of Hacettepe University Department of American Culture and Literature, we would like to welcome you all to the 38th International American Studies Conference organized by the Department of American Culture and Literature and the American Studies Association of Turkey. The rector of Hacettepe University, Professor Dr. Haluk Özen, has sent us a message welcoming our guests and wishing us a successful conference. Now I'd like to invite Professor Dr. Meldan Tanrısal, the President of the American Studies Association of Turkey, to make her opening remarks.
I have to make some changes here before I begin. I usually disappear behind the podium, but I hope you can see me. Well, dear colleagues, the most distinguished guests, and dear students, I'd like to welcome you to the 38th Biennial International ASAT conference, which this year coincides with the 35th anniversary of our department and also the 50th anniversary of our university. We are proud of our department and grateful to our former professors, Professor Dr. Gülün Yüceler, who has come all the way from Istanbul, Associate Professor Dr. Gülüz Biken, Associate Professor Dr. Saadet Bozkurt, for establishing the department. We would also like to thank Professor Dr. Emel Doğrumacı, the Dean and Chair at the time, without whose approval this dream would not have come true. She was going to join us. Unfortunately, she is in bed and has a very bad cold. At this point, I'd like to mention Professor Dr. Necda Aytur from Ankara University, who unfortunately has passed a couple of weeks ago. She planted the seeds of American studies in Turkey. She was one of the co-founders of the American Studies Association of Turkey, and she founded the department at Ankara University. Yet it did not last and was re-established later. Therefore, I'm happy to say that our American Culture and Literature Department is the oldest one and the one and only department that offers a PhD program in Turkey. Since our chair, Associate Professor Dr. Bilge Mutluay Çetintaş, will talk about its history, I'm not going to go into the details of that. Our department has flourished. The American Studies Association of Turkey will be celebrating its 30th anniversary next year, and the Journal of American Studies of Turkey is being published twice a year. In fact, the 47th issue has just come out. You can find it on the desk. Throughout the 35 years, the contributions of American Fulbright professors to American Studies in Turkey have been immense. Professor William Jones was among the founders of the department. He came to teach twice after its establishment. There are many names, but I'm not going to name them over here, but there's another unforgettable name, Professor Dr. Robert Bertolf, who was our visiting Fulbright in the 1994-1995 academic year. And I'm very sorry to say that we lost him last year. The 46th issue of JUST contains a tribute dedicated to Professor Bertolf, and the 47th issue contains one dedicated to Professor Necda Aytur. May they rest in peace. Could we now take a minute of silence to commemorate Professor Artur, and Professor Bertol, and all our soldiers who have lost their lives for the well-being of our country. As you well know, the theme of this year's conference is manifestations of love and hate in American culture and literature. Love and hate seem to go hand in hand at times. Unfortunately, our relationship with the U.S. has been fluctuating between these feelings in the last couple of years. With the recent developments, one cannot help thinking whether we are allies or enemies. Instead of building bridges, the two countries are drifting apart. One thing we have in common is our similar presidents, who are far from uniting people and bringing peace to the world. Even our relationship as an American Culture and Literature Department with the American Embassy has become a series of broken promises in recent years. However, seeing the efforts of the Embassy to bring our keynote speaker, Professor Strait, raises our hopes for the future. I am sure we will work together again and make possible what the politicians cannot achieve. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Our aim as the American Studies Association of Turkey is to bring people together. We do this by organizing conferences which help connect academics with academics and students. This arduous task becomes even more difficult with a low or no budget. Nevertheless, despite the fact that this is a small conference, because of our guests who could not attend due to the visa ban, this will be a productive, successful conference where new connections will be made. Just a few more words before I leave the stage. I would like to express my deep gratitude to the American Embassy, especially to Deputy Cultural Affairs Officer Mr. Saad Buhari, for overcoming the obstacles and bringing our keynote speaker. I would like to extend my thanks to the chair of our department, Associate Professor Dr. Ugemi for all her efforts. She spent endless hours working on the computer, and of course, the members of our department. I would also like to express our gratitude to our university and the president, Professor Dr. Haluk Özen, for hosting us and for his warm support. A special word of thanks goes to my fellow ASAT board members, our treasurer, Vahit Yaşayan, and secretary and assistant editor, assistant professor Dr. Berkem Gürenkli. Is she outside? Okay. And our vice president, associate professor Dr. Tanfer Emin Tunç, the delegates, Dr. Emine Geçgil, and of course, assistant professor Dr. Cem Kılıçarslan, And last but not least, the editor-in-chief of JUST, Associate Professor Dr. Özlem Uzundemir. Unfortunately, she cannot attend because she is at the opening of some hall, I believe, at Çankaya University. But she will join us at the reception. Without them, this conference could not have been organized. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tanrısal. Now I'd like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Didem Kıvanç, the Chair of the Department of American Culture and Literature, to make her opening remarks.
Distinguished professors, colleagues, guests, and dear students, we are honored that you are with us to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the Department of American Culture and Literature with our penta-annual event. Penta-annual, that's a new word. We celebrate the anniversary of the department every 5 years with a themed conference every 5 years. As you are all aware, this year's theme is about binary oppositions, love and hate. Allow me to temporarily privilege the first half of that binary opposition, love. Tina Turner's song, What's Love Got to Do With It, received a Grammy Award for Best Song in 1984. Ironically, that year reminds me of the title of George Orwell's dystopian novel. I hope we don't end like that. The lyrics goes like this. What's love got to do with it? What's love but a second-hand emotion? Who needs a heart when a heart can be broken? Cheesy, but catchy. Love has got everything to do with it. The seeds of this department were first planted in 1978, but the department was established in 1982 by a small group of dedicated academics who loved their jobs and saw a potential for the study in this field. Gönül Hocam, we are honored by your presence. Ayşe Hocam, Himmet Hocam, Burçin Hocam, thank you for being here. I'm not going to repeat what my friend and colleague Meldan Tanrısal has just mentioned, but allow me to make a few additional comments. A lot has happened since those early years. The department curriculum was revised several times to make it more compatible with American Studies programs in the United States. Our master's and doctorate programs were also revised. Colleagues were hired and the department grew. Thanks to the Fulbright program, we were able to host many valuable academics who guided us in our efforts to update the program. Professor Bertolf, may he rest in peace, were among those Fulbright scholars. Our department now has 13 faculty members, 2 professors, 2 associate professors, 4 assistant professors, and 5 research assistants. We have 425 undergraduate and 40 graduate students. We are a department that is proud to have undertaken the study of culture and literature, and we endow our students with the tools they will need to understand any culture and literature, especially our own. As renowned 13th century Turkish poet Yunus Emre says, Yunus Emre der hoca, gerekse var bin harça, hepsinden iyice bir gönüle girmektir. With Professor Tevat Halman's translation, Yunus Emre says to you, Pharisee, make a holy pilgrimage, if need be, 100 times, but if you ask me, the visit to a heart is best of all. Allow me to remind you of another expression, the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to put together a conference. And certainly, it would be harder to organize a conference without the help of the members of the American Studies Association of Turkey. Also, we would have been unable to hold this conference without the help of all. I welcome you on behalf of all the members of the Department of American Culture and Literature.
Thank you, Professor Çetintaş. the Bella Quartet, comprised of Merve Yatır on first violin, Kürün Üstün on second violin, Pınar Aydınlık on viola, and İpek Gürel on cello.
Now we're ready for the serious. I am very, very happy to introduce Professor Susan Straight to you. We met 3 years ago in Salzburg, at the Salzburg seminar. And ever since, we've been writing to each other. She has recommended books to me. We study them in class. And now I'm going to say a few words about her. She is Distinguished Professor of Creative Writing at the University of California, Riverside, where she taught since 1988. She received the university's Distinguished Teaching Award in 2008. Currently, she is Director of the Master of Fine Arts program and serves on the Academy of Distinguished Teachers at the university. She is a prolific writer. You might have already read her bio, and she has published 8 novels, if not more. And I was very surprised to read the titles of the novels. They're very impressive. Aqua Boogie, I've got that book, by the way. I love this one. I've been in Saro's kitchen and licked out all the pots, which was named one of the best novels of 1992. Then there is High Wire Noon, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and won the Commonwealth of California Gold Medal for Fiction. Well, I have to say that almost all her books have been bestsellers. And, to make it short, right? A Million Nightingales was the one we studied in my graduate class last year. We enjoyed it very much. And there's another book, well, that was a book that was the finalist for the 2006 Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the 2006 Southern California Booksellers Award. Take One Candle, Light a Room was published October 2010. The book features characters from the previous novels and is set in Los Angeles, Rio Seco, and Louisiana during August 2005. It was named a best novel of 2010 by the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and Kirkus. Her latest novel, the final in the Rio Seco trilogy, is Between Heaven and Here, and I'm very happy to say I was able to finish it this Sunday. It was published in 2012. It was also named a best book of 2012 by the Los Angeles Times and the Daily Beast. She has also written a book for children, I believe. And I have to say, in 1988, she received a Guggenheim Fellowship for Fiction. In November 2007, she received the Lannan Award for Fiction for her body of work. And in 2011, the Gina Berrio Award for Fiction from San Francisco State University. Well, the title of her talk today is "A Million Nightingales on the Branches of My Heart. Race, History, and 6 Generations of Women in a Trilogy of Fiction." Without further ado, Professor Strait.
Is it okay if I'm sitting? You can see me well enough, can't you? I'm used to standing, but it's better if I don't stand. And I don't. I think this is the last one. Yeah. Can we go to the very? I'm really bad at this. It would be the first one would be a woman in a tignon, which is a tall headdress. Yes, that's the first. So that's perfect. Thank you. I want to say thank you. This is such a classy. This is very classy conference. It's beautiful. Everything from the design of the bags and the logo, the way the heart looks in red. It's just gorgeous. Who designed the logo?
Well, Burak played an important role. There was another student of mine.
Just beautiful. Having been to many conferences, I also wanted to say that I was just really impressed with the title. Manifestations of Love and Hate in American Culture and Literature is so smart because manifestations is a beautiful word, first of all, but we never talk about love and hate, do we? We talk about lots of things that are larger in a sense, in terms of word, but those are the big deals. And anyway, thank you for inviting me. Also, I've always wanted to come here to Turkey, always, since I was 5. My mom taught me to read when I was 3. That's a story for another day, since she was an immigrant and only had a green card, and spent her last 25 cents on a book for me at the grocery store after my father had abandoned us. It's a good thing she didn't leave me in the grocery store, but instead bought me a book. And then I went to the local library after that, and I found many, many books. I used to stare at pictures of Turkey and dream of coming here. So anyway, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming.
What I want to talk to you about requires me to ask you a couple of questions first. I know we're teachers in here, but how many of you are actually creative writers too? How many of you are working on fiction or poetry or even nonfiction? Oh, you don't want to tell me? It's just a few? All right, and how many of you, this is another really important one, how many of you think you would want someday to teach? Maybe. You guys are like, no, that seems like a terrible job. Maybe you might want to teach literature. Well, the reason I ask you that is because I'm going to talk to you about sort of the process of writing, but also how we think of things in larger terms, especially these words, because these are things we often don't talk about. As novelists, professors, readers, and students, we don't really talk often about the raw emotions of literature. We talk about love, this is true, but we don't often talk about this word hate. And we need to even more right now, especially given some of the things we were talking about in our opening remarks. We also actually, though, think about it. We don't talk about shame, do we? We don't often talk about fear. We talk about desire, but not really in terms of literature. And one of the most powerful emotions, I have to say, and I'm wondering what you think, is guilt. So I want to ask you to do something right now. I want you to think about one of your most vivid childhood memories. Just think, very quickly. How many of you thought about something that made you feel terribly guilty? Be honest. Anybody? We rarely remember the happiest date ever. You guys are like, no, I remember that. I'm saying that sort of innately, as humans, we remember fear, don't we? And terror, but we often don't talk about shame or guilt. Recently I taught a class, I taught a graduate class, and we used books by Sherwood Anderson, Winesburg, Ohio, but we also used Junot Jia's book, Drown. And I taught those as parallels, because even though they're separated by generations, by culture, even by landscape, at the heart of both of those books is shame and guilt and love. So for the trilogy of novels I want to talk about today, Those raw emotions, those vivid images wrought in my mind, came from brief stories or events. I spent 15 years working on these 3 books. And for those of you who aren't writers, you're like, wow, 15 years, that seems like an incredibly long amount of time. That's just what happened. And the seeds of these 3 novels came from stories or overheard snatches of conversation. I thought you might find that interesting. This picture is from the Historic New Orleans collection, and it's titled merely A Free Woman of Color. So she is what would be called a mulatto, something that my 3 children, who are 7 different racial backgrounds, now are studying and find odd as a word, right? It's not a word that's acceptable in some societies anymore. But during the time of this woman, she was called a mulatto. At the beginning of this trilogy, a young girl named Amina, who is Muslim, is brought on a slave ship from Senegal to Louisiana in 1776. And by the end of my writing of this, in 2010, her descendants are living in Southern California. And novels are elusive creatures. The Rio Seco trilogy came from these seemingly unrelated stories. I heard them from older people, from children, in unexpected moments where people were telling family legends. I saw them in undated photographs. I heard them in family secrets. I found them in legal documents, porch whispers, and fireplace tales. But the other thread that I thought I would talk to you about today, the reason I wrote, the thread that bound all of these novels was my nighttime terrors of raising 3 mixed-race girls. As a mother and as a novelist, it's always about imagination and sort of the desire to disappear into something else. So, I'm not sure, I don't know, I'm looking at your faces and I don't know if you like being asked questions, but I don't like just sitting up here talking to you. I would like to ask you questions, and I want to ask you this one now. Anyone willing to say where you heard a story that you never forgot? It was an unexpected story, perhaps, but it's something that stayed with you forever. Anyone willing to say? Where? Yes? Uh-huh.
Should I tell the story?
I mean, if it's short, just tell me, where did you hear this story?
One of my relatives, actually, from my aunt.
From her aunt, okay. And where were you when you heard it?
In her home, actually. We were talking about babies, and she told me one of them, really miracle one.
Thank you. Sorry, I know I didn't say to you guys I was going to ask questions. As soon as women start talking about babies, it gets dangerous, right? Everyone in the room knows this. Women can talk about other stuff, but as soon as we start talking about babies, oh no.
Yeah.
So you heard a story from your aunt, and you never forgot it.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes? No? Yes?
My grandfather told me a story when I was like, I don't know, 4 or 5 or something, and it sort of traumatized me. Thinking back to it, I mean, it sort of traumatized me, and it stood with me since, like, whenever.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I wanted to say. Is sometimes a writer will find sort of an abstract idea, right? But for me, these stories, maybe you're right, maybe they were traumatizing because I couldn't get them out of my mind. For me, you're looking at me and you're thinking, oh, she's a short, blonde, white woman, what is she doing writing about people of color? My husband looks, well, does anybody know pro basketball? Shaquille O'Neal. This is a very tall man. He's 6'4", he weighs 310 pounds, and he's a correctional officer. That means he never smiles. I smile. We were born in the same hospital. I live a mile away from that hospital right now. I was 14 when I met him on the school bus. But we were born to parents who had survived terrible privation, violence, and poverty and made their way to Riverside, California, which that would seem to you like, well, everything was fine once they got to California. But no, they traumatized us with their memories and their stories, which is what we do as humans. How do we process these stories? For me, I process them by writing fiction. At 16, I was in the kitchen of his mother's house. I was washing dishes in a narrow linoleum corridor, and I heard this phrase that transformed me. And it it later became the title of one of the novels. I don't make them up, I'm not that smart. I always overhear them. There were two women standing behind me. Both of them were elderly. And one of them I knew had 6 children, and the other one had 1. And the one said, "Oh, that's right, you just had the 1 kid, didn't you?" And the other one heard that little gloat in her friend's voice, and she replied fiercely, "Take but 1 candle, light a room." And I thought, that's a transformative phrase. Because at that point I'd been reading James Baldwin at 16, Lucy Maud Montgomery, Anne of Green Gables novels I read over and over again. I read Toni Morrison and Leslie Marmon Silko. These are all wonderful American writers, but they're all authors whose characters tend to speak a lot in metaphor and imagery and really lyrical phrases. Just as this woman behind me had. And I realized that that's what I loved about language. Even though I was 16, I was completely uneducated in a way. I was expected to just get married and have kids. I decided I wanted to be a writer. I heard that in my head, and things shifted. When I was 17, just after that, we went to a local park for a family reunion. Again, standing behind me, this time were 2 men. I was helping serve food. You know how women have to serve the side dishes in the line, and the men are serving the meat? These 2 men stood behind me, and one of them asked, "Well, how did you guys get to California?" I knew both of the men were from Louisiana. And the other one said, "Well, you know what? I had a beautiful daughter, and we were living on Mr. So-and-so's place, on Mr. So-and-so's plantation." And he named a small village in Louisiana. And he said one weekend, Mr. So-and-so, this is the plantation owner, said he was going to come and get my daughter. Now that doesn't sound scary, right? But you know what I mean. He said, you know, he did that with the girls. He would take them away for a week. He said, so that night we packed up and left. My cousins were living out in California already, and we never went back. If I were to ask you when you thought that happened, you'd say, oh, maybe the early 1900s, right? That happened in 1952. So I went to school with a daughter who would have been taken away and probably raped by the plantation owner. I couldn't forget any of those stories. That fall I went to Los Angeles for university, and I didn't know what I was going to be. I will say, because I have a friend in the audience, I thought I was going to be a sports writer because my mother wanted to marry. My mother was born in Switzerland, decided she wanted to marry the Dodgers announcer from whom she had learned to speak English. She'd already been married twice, so I didn't think that was a good idea. I went to Los Angeles, and I was 17 years old, and I rode the bus with the most beautiful woman in the world. I mean, the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. And she became the character that you just read about in Between Heaven and Here. Her skin was like hammered gold, the gilt of ancient picture frames. Every day, when we rode the bus, men would leap onto the bus, hand her a dime. That tells you how old I am, because you could make a phone call for a dime. Some people in this room won't laugh. They would hand her a dime and a piece of paper and say, baby, just call me. Just give me a chance. Just give me 5 minutes. Just give me 1 weekend. I need you, baby. I can't live without you. Look at you. You're so beautiful. Now, I look like this. So I was sitting in my seat in the bus, completely unnoticed. And she looked like that. And do you think that made her happy? No. It was terrible to watch. She felt, I think, as if she were being preyed upon. And that was also a transformative moment for me. Because I sort of saw at that moment, I was 17 and she was maybe 25. If you were that beautiful, then it could be dangerous. And if you were prey, even as she got off the bus, men would follow her, they would touch her hair, and they would say, if you just gave me a chance, I could be the one. We were both walking the same way, we both worked in offices. That stayed with me too, and I never forgot it. So, if you're wondering where this photo comes from, and you saw them briefly in the last photo, they're very beautiful. And even when they were 5 and 7 and 8 years old, men would touch their hair. And women would say, you have to be careful for them. And then one day, an older man said to me, oh, you don't have to worry about this one, pointing to my middle daughter. She'll never have to work. What kind of thing is that to say to someone, right? What does that mean? How would she make her living? No. All my children, I thought, deserved to be thought of as intellectuals as well. So I thought about beauty and I freaked out, and at night when I put them to bed, I wrote about this woman. So I'm going to read you a little tiny excerpt from A Million Nightingales. And this is the book that I spent a lot of time researching in Louisiana. Do you like to be read to? You don't mind? Yes? No? You all look very dubious. I went to Louisiana for 5 years to research the book. And what I've just said to you is all true things. And I wanted to maybe say to you how novelists take something that's true, and something that hurts, and something that's terrifying, and something that is also unforgettable, and use our imaginations to put it into literature. So I decided I would write about a young woman of mixed race. The woman I mentioned to you in the beginning of this talk, Amina, was brought on the ship. Her name was changed by her French owner to Marie-Thérèse, and she was given away for a week to a French sugar broker while he was visiting. So she was a gift. And after he left, she had a baby. And this is her daughter, Monette. We lived between. Le Quartier was one long street, houses lining the dirt road to the cane fields and the sugar house, but a grove of pecan trees separated the street from the Bordelon's house. Trétit, the cook, lived in the kitchen behind the house, and Nonc Pierre, the groom, lived in the barn. But my mother's house was in a clearing near 3 pecan trees at the edge of the cane fields. A path led from the main road to our yard. Madame Bordelon could see us from her second-floor gallery. She could see what color clothes we hung, or whether we had washed the table linens, but she could never hear what we said. And under the trees, my mother spoke to me every day, but only when she had something to teach me, and only when we were alone. When I was young, I asked her the same thing many times until I understood. There's a little bit of French in here. Ma mère, I said. Oui, she said. Who do I belong to? And my mother never hesitated. Me, she said. You are mine. No one else? I said. No. Not Monsieur? That's the plantation owner. No. Not God? Then she would pause. My mother would pour another dipper of water onto the wood ashes held in the wooden trough over the big pot because we were making soap. No. My mother's voice rushed from her throat, harsh like she was chewing coffee beans. Here on earth, you belong to me, no one else. If you die, then you belong là-bas, in the sky. My mother then said to me, if you died, I would have to go too. And I asked her, how would you get there? Là-bas, with God. And my mother said, the way I do everything else, I would do it to myself. So, all those years, I think, of scary stories, of the little stories, I was thinking about beauty. I was thinking about what it would be like if you were a mother during slavery. If I were a mother during slavery and I had 3 children, now you can show it it's still further, that one, sorry. Those are my 3 daughters when they were little. That is me looking completely anonymous of them. In that photo, which was taken at a wedding, I see all their essential natures. So I sit up here talking to you as an academic and a professor and a novelist, but also as a mother, because those things are inextricably entwined in my life. So when I would put them to bed at night, and I would imagine, what would I do if we were in slavery? What would happen to children who look like mine? If we're being honest, you know the answer. What would happen to them? Anybody? What's your guess? You're so quiet. They would be sold away from me, all right? I would be staying up all night, as the mother does in this novel, hoping that no one would come in the middle of the night and pick up my children and take them away and sell them for $800. And my children would have been worth a lot because of their beauty. And they would have been used for one thing. Now, that's a horrible thing to say to you, but that is the truth of what led me to write these novels. The youngest one, Rosette, who never smiles like that anymore because she's 21 now, is the next little story. When she was 5, we were walking up the street after kindergarten, and I live in a very small house in a fairly poor neighborhood because that's where I've lived for 30 years, and that's my safety net. And when we talk about community, I looked at the women playing the instruments up here, and that was a community, wasn't it? Those 4 women, like you have to be a community. I'm not willing to leave my community that is full of family that helped me raise my kids. So we still live in the same place. We were walking up the block, and it was Thanksgiving. So in California, we made pilgrim headdresses and Indian headdresses. And here's my youngest child, who, when you see her later photos, is the darkest of all my children. And she said, "How did I get Indian in me?" It was November of 2000. And you know, the traditional American narrative, pilgrims, Indians, pumpkins, turkey, corn, everyone got along. I didn't think I could say that to her, because Rosette's dad is descended in part from a Cherokee man in Tennessee who fell in love with 2 sisters who were slaves. And that's the real part. Of the novel I read you, that's the research part. But the real part is that to see them, this man tunneled a secret passage from outside the plantation boundaries, underneath a fence, and it came up just inside the fence. With the one sister named Catherine, he had 6 or 7 children by the end of the Civil War and the immediate aftermath, when she actually remained indentured on the plantation. And one of her daughters was named Fine. If you can go now, there's a picture that's kind of crinkly looking. One more, I think. Nope, I'm sorry, it was back there. Just stop there, thank you. I'm not making it easy for you. This is not Fine, but I'm going to tell you what happened to Fine. Her father left for Texas, her mother died, and when she was 6 years old, this is in 1870s, she was given away to a white family. Not as a slave, because it wasn't even slavery. She wasn't even sold. She was just given away. She was forced to chop wood. She had no clothes. She was forced to draw water. She was beaten, and she was starved. This is hard to explain to a 5-year-old, is it not? So what I told my 5-year-old about instead was how fierce Fine was. I told her the story of the bullet. When Fine was 9 years old one day, she found a bullet close to where she was chopping wood. It could have been from the Civil War, it could have been from someone shooting, but she put that bullet in her apron pocket. And Fine was 9 years old. She was under the impression that if she threw the bullet hard enough and it hit someone, that person would die. She saved it for a long time in her apron pocket. These are stories that I heard when I was 16 and 17 about my husband's ancestors. And they were a bit traumatizing because this gets worse. One day while Fine was chopping wood, the elderly matriarch of the family, the one who beat her the most, approached and started yelling at her. And Fine thought this was the day. She thought she was going to kill this old woman and run away. So she threw the bullet as hard as she could, and it hit the old woman in the head. And then it bounced off harmlessly onto the ground. The old woman assumed it had been a chip of wood, and she beat Fine to within an inch of her life for disobedience. Fine did run away. She ran away, and at 13 she was living alone in the woods with no shoes, picking blackberries to sell by the side of the road, and she met a man who was 20 and very handsome, and she had her first child at 14. And this was her first child. This woman's name was Jenny Stevenson. Now, so she's part Cherokee, she's part African, she's part mystery woman. Jenny herself migrated to Tulsa at 14. And this is a difficult story to tell, but she became a prostitute. She had no other way of living. And one night, sorry to tell you one last appalling story, but Jenny lived in the back house where black men came. And the owner of the brothel lived in the front house where a white man came. And a white man went to the back house and attempted to rape her. And she was 16. And she pulled a gun and shot him in the head. What should have happened to her after that is that she should have been lynched and killed. And her white friend dragged the body to the front and pretended that he had come to visit her and that she had shot him. This is a story that I did not clearly tell my 5-year-old. I told her the story of the bullet, and I told her that there were slaves. And as you can imagine, my 5-year-old stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and said, "You can't buy people. That can't happen. You can't have a piece of paper and buy a person." We never talked about Thanksgiving again that day. We talked about the bullet. And then we kept walking home, and her 5-year-old mind was already processing this notion of her own female ancestors. So that's part of what I thought we should talk about today. Where do you take love, and where do you take hate, and where do you take fear and shame and guilt? Where do you take community? Where do you take women? Where do you take men? How do you tell that story to a 5-year-old? Do you lie? You can't lie, can you? Especially not now, because you, my younger people in the audience, you can find out everything, can't you? All you have to do is the famous word. I'm sorry, what is it?
Google.
Yeah, and now my middle daughter's boyfriend, who's from Nigeria, works for Google. So everything comes full circle, doesn't it? Because my middle daughter will probably marry someone who was born in Africa, who works for Google. All I'm saying to you is that the only way for us to think about these manifestations of love and hate and shame and guilt and fear is perhaps to tell the story, right? You can't hide the story, can you? You can hide it for some time, but you can't hide it forever. When I worked on this book, I went to Louisiana for 5 years. I researched that, you don't have to show it again. No, you're fine. I just meant the picture that he was kind enough to show you in the beginning stayed by my computer. That is not someone who's related to me. That is someone who ended up being freed. This book, and some of you have read it, is about a woman who has to buy her own son out of slavery. She owns him, and she's unable to free him because the law at the time says that she cannot free him until he's 21. So she buys her own son, and then she sells him, she mortgages him, she rents him out, and finally she loses him. The way I found this story of this woman who could not read or write was through court documents. So I wanted to say to you also, stories come to us in unexpected places, don't they? I was in the library, I found a little tiny anthology, and there was a 16-page essay about a slave woman named Manon Baldwin who was freed, but then had to buy her own 4-year-old son, and then mortgaged him out, sold him to keep a building, to keep a piece of property. That's the only way she could feed him. And then she lost him. She never learned to read and write. She only signed her name X. But all of her story is contained in court documents because she never wanted anyone to take advantage of her. So that's how I found her story. And for years I dreamt about her and I imagined her, and that's who I wrote about. There's a character in here named Juanette that I based on this Manon Baldwin, and that's who I read about first. Later she escapes, and that was one of the hardest things that I ever had to write about, was this notion that she would try to escape. She was brought back and she was branded on the shoulder with a hot iron. And the young woman who helps her is named Fantine. In the beginning, when you think about it, when people talk about, especially those of you who are teaching literature, reading literature, but also writing literature, one thing I thought that would be really valuable for you to hear is this new notion, and I'm not sure if you've heard this, but people are, why must female characters always be likable? Have any of you heard this recently? People say, well, male characters are allowed to be unlikable, but female characters are always supposed to be likable. And I think that's interesting, because if you imagine yourself during slavery, does everyone have to be noble and likable? Sometimes people are just trying to survive, as they might have been in your own families. When I wrote the character of Fantine, who helps her out with putting salt meat on her back, I was imagining someone who didn't like Juanette in the beginning. And later, then in the next book, Take One Candle, there's a young woman named Fantine. It becomes a family name. So, I wanted to say this to you. Only novels, for me, only novels allow us to fully inhabit someone else's world completely. True? I love all art. I do love music. My middle kid does photography. She's an art historian. I love photographs. I do like going to the movies. I love poetry. For me, when I read a novel, I'm fully in that world. Do you feel that way often? You are fully immersed in that world. You cannot escape that world. Maybe you're traumatized by that world. Maybe you stay up all night to finish reading because you can't imagine what's going to happen to that character. That's what makes me a writer. That's what makes me a novelist. In a sense, American fiction can't be reductive. It cannot ignore the hate, equality, shame, fear, the guilt. The morality of a story for me is to make it as true as possible, even if it's terrifying, and to make it as fully imagined as I can. And for me, with those 3 kids sleeping at night and imagining what I would write about, I had to be very careful. I didn't want my kids later, now they're in their 20s, to read my books and think I was insane. That happened anyway. They did read my books, and what they're fond of saying is, congratulations, you're the worst person in the world. You make people cry. People email you that they cried, that they stayed up all night, that you terrified them, and they're like, yay, you're really good at your job. When I think about the next book, I have to tell you one more. Can you stand one more sad story? Yes? No? It's hard to tell because you're so polite. You're looking at me like, yes, we're listening to you, but really we're thinking about something else. I'm going to tell you one more story. And it's a scary one. So after this book, The Million Nightingales, I started working on this book, but first I wrote the last page of this novel. So I'm going to tell you about both of them quickly. And this is probably the worst of all the stories, so I'm sorry that I saved it for last. Another kindergarten story. This entire trilogy, 15 years worth of work, 15 years worth of spending almost every night writing these things, also happened in kindergarten. My middle kid, you could show the last one now, so everybody can see it down, right? My middle kid is the one in the white shirt on the left. She's 26 now. But when she was in kindergarten, I know you're thinking, oh, those are really beautiful people, and they all look like Beyonce, and who are you again? Like, where did you, is there any of you in there? Just the brains, that's all. They're always like, Mom, why did you give us your brain? It's a terrible brain to have. When that little kid was in kindergarten, one day a week, because I was teaching, I was a professor, one day a week I went, and my job was to be a mom. You know, the mom who sits there and does glue stick stuff and cuts things out and makes books, 6 little pumpkins sitting on a fence. I have that same book. If she was 6, and she's 26 now, 20 years ago, she made this little book, and it was this month. I realized that when I got ready to give this talk. It was 20 years ago this month that we made 6 little pumpkins sitting on a fence. One fell off and how many were left? That day, my job was to help cut out the little pumpkins, and my job really was to take care of a kid named Dion. Once a week I would help with scissors and glue and books of trees with leaves that fell off, how many leaves fell off. But Dion became my charge because I tied his shoes and I talked to him and he wasn't scared of me and he would sit on my lap. He was 6 years old. His hair was uncombed, his sneakers were really big, the size of bread loaves on his little feet. So I knew they weren't his. He must have gotten them from an older cousin or something. Kindergarten was exhausting to him. His hair was uncombed and dusty, and he fell asleep every single day. So it became my job to read to him, have him sit in my lap. And one afternoon I met his grandfather in the parking lot, and his grandfather was I think my father-in-law knew. I'd seen him before. He lived out in the country, but Dion and his mom lived 3 blocks from me in an apartment building. And during recess, 2 weeks after the little pumpkins were falling off the fence, right about now, I went outside because it was my job to keep an eye on them during recess, and Dion kept tugging at the waistband of his jeans. I asked him if he had to use the bathroom, and he shook his head, but I could see that his eyes were glittering. He had tears in his eyes, and I knew he was in pain somehow. When I turned away, he lifted his striped polo shirt absent-mindedly, and I saw burns on the lower part of his belly. I almost threw up. I said to him, "Hey, little man, we gotta go inside and put some cream on that ouchie." I tried to keep my voice casual, even though I thought I was gonna throw up. I asked him if it hurt, and he shook his head vehemently. And then my daughter and her friends came running up to say, "Why is Dion going into the office?" I said he had an ouchie. And inside the nurse's office, she looked at the blistered skin where his waistband chafed, and he said quickly, and this was a story, a pot of soup fell on me. Where I live, in October, when I left for here, it was 99 degrees. No one's cooking soup in October. He wouldn't look at us, and when she unsnapped his jeans, there were round pink burns like roses. Further down. This was not soup. This was cigarettes. Because I grew up with foster kids, and I had seen what cigarette burns looked like. You cannot mistake what looks like a puckered flower on someone's skin. Child Protective Services was called, and his grandfather said it was soup. His mother said it was soup, and Dion said it was soup. I met his mom a couple weeks later in the parking lot, and we were the same age. I knew I had seen her at high school, at a football game, at a dance. She asked how many kids I had, and I said 3. She said 5. She smiled at me gently and said, "Are you the one that brought him all those shoes?" And I said yes, because I have 200 nieces and nephews, and it's easy for me to collect shoes. I gave her a frozen turkey in November for Thanksgiving, and she looked at it as if it was space debris. What would a woman do with a frozen turkey when she was sitting stiffly on a couch in the apartment where Delphine and I went to deliver the food, and there were 2 men on either side of her? She couldn't move. They controlled every particle of oxygen in the room. I put the bag on the Formica counter. After Thanksgiving, Dion never came back to school, and we never saw him again. He would also be 26 now, would he not? My daughter is 26. She read the pumpkin book, and then the snowflake book. In the spring, she read the daisy book. How many petals are left on the daisy? She went to college. She worked in a museum. Now she's getting a PhD in art history and African American studies, and she specializes in historic Black photography. She sends me pictures all the time. When I thought about Dion, every evening, as I walked past the apartment where he lived, and I realized I didn't know if he was even still alive, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so I'm going to read you a little tiny piece, and I don't know what our time is. I wanted to make sure I leave time for questions and answers, although you're all looking at me with nothing but terror. She has said nothing but terror, terrible things. I don't have any questions for her. I want her to go away. I wanted to read you a little part about this because I wanted to say again that what fiction does is not to save anyone. It is, in a sense, a selfish act and yet a generous act, is it not? For whatever reason, because my mom didn't finish high school, my dad didn't finish high school, and I got to go to college. For whatever reason, I was given this brain that translates things into literature. It seemed to be my job to tell you stories. So, I started with Dion, who I made into Victor, and then I wrote this book, and then I circled back around. And the character of Victor, as it turns out, is the son of that beautiful woman I met on the bus. And she's so beautiful, and she's had a son, and her son's name is Victor. And she becomes an addict, she's abandoned, and bad things happen to this character of Victor. And I thought I would end this novel thinking that Victor hated his mother. It's hard to hate your mother, isn't it? No matter what she does. My mom is the meanest mom on the planet, by the way. I realized after 15 years of writing this trilogy, from Amina, who arrived on the slave ship, and thinking about Fine, and thinking about Jenny, and I'll tell you the rest of the pictures in a moment, that I ended with this character, Victor, and he didn't hate his mother at all. He loved his mother. He was burned because a man was an idiot, not because his mother was an idiot. His mother was asleep when it happened, and she didn't know. I wrote about the kind of apartment complex that has a balcony on the top, and Victor's mother's name is Glorette. So I just want to read you 2 little paragraphs about. Sorry. The teacher's in conference with his mother at school, her sitting all long legs in the desk chair, staring out the window at whatever trees were in the elementary school courtyard. His aunt in the kitchen of Uncle Enrique's house, his Aunt Fantine, his great-great-aunt, Monette. None of them understood his mother. He grew up in the Riviera, in the apartment complex that had 3 palm trees in the center. Just cement, 3 palm trees, nothing else. But his mother knew the other trees. Glorette was the most beautiful woman in Rio Seco, and yet she showed him how to find bees in the pepper tree trunks, spiders in the eucalyptus bark as it shed the long flat sheaves. And in the 4th grade, they studied California Indians. She took Victor to the river bottom. He found the perfect piece of bark for his project. His mother took him to the paddle-shaped cactus, which had tiny insects on it. Their name was cochineal. Their blood was magenta, a color he had never seen, even among his mother's eyeshadows and her nail polish. And she showed him how to paint the bark with designs in insect blood. She used to keep the bark picture in her trunk. They were evicted every 3 months. They lived in a different apartment every 3 months. The lock had been busted over and over again when people broke into it looking for drugs or jewelry. But no one wanted the bark. One time someone got pissed when he couldn't find what he was looking for, and he broke the bark in half and threw it on the floor. But Victor's mother glued it together. She wrapped magenta ribbon from the drugstore around each end, and she hung it on the wall. He saw her staring at it sometimes when she lay on the couch. At each apartment, she hung it on the wall near the door, and she talked to him about the moon and the sun and the stars. That part's in the beginning. Victor's mother is killed. It was part of the genesis for me writing about this character. And if you could show me one more picture, it's of my nephew. There's only one guy. This is my nephew, Sensei. He has dreadlocks, just like the character of Victor. And Sensei came to live with me just during the time I was working on this book. He looks kind of like the reincarnation of Bob Marley. He's 6'2". He's a skateboarder, an intellectual, and yet everyone tried to kill him. During the time he lived with me, he was shot at by the police. He was shot at by gang members who were angry that he wasn't a gang member. He was shot at by other gang members who thought he was a gang member. And one night when he was skateboarding, he was jacked by Mexican-American gang members who pointed a gun at his chest and made him give up the skateboard. He came home that night, sobbing, crying. He's 6'2", and he had his head down between his knees, and he could do nothing but pet the dog. And Rosette, the youngest kid, the one that you've heard enough about, she and I sat there next to him while he cried. When I think about a character like Victor, and I think about raising my nephew, Sensei, I was thinking about love, hate, and community, and that's really how we make it, right? We make it through community. So then I went all the way back to Jenny. You saw her picture in the fur coat. And there's a word that comes from India called biraderi. Does anybody know this word? B-I-R-A-D-E-R-I. I'm not pronouncing it right, I'm pronouncing it like a Californian, I'm sure. But the concept of this word means that your family is not the only family you have. And I thought this concept might be interesting to this particular audience. Biraderi is the concept of your kin, your kinship. I said I had 400 nieces and nephews, right? And you guys were up there doing the math like, wait, what? I'm sorry, what just happened? How much sex do they have in that family? What's going on? My mother-in-law is one of 4 daughters, but each daughter had 6 kids. My father-in-law is one of 6 kids. There were many kids. When you look at the way a family works, my brother-in-law, Sensei is his son, has 8 kids. I have 3 kids. My real father was married 4 times. I have brothers and sisters I've never even met. The concept of biraderi means that you choose your family. It's the combination of your blood family, your married family, and the family that you choose. So, Sensei is my brother-in-law's 5th child by a woman I've never met, who he knew for 2 months, who is Samoan, Mexican, and Irish. My brother-in-law is Cherokee, Creek, African, Irish. What does that make Sensei? Makes him my nephew, all right? He has dreads, he's a good skateboarder, and I would take care of him. Would I do anything for him? I did. Skateboards cost $40 each, and he broke 13 of them in a very short time. He also ate, one day, 21 taquitos. We only had 22, and there were like 3 other kids at the house, so we ate a fourth of a taquito. A taquito's not that big. What I'm saying to you is, the concept of biraderi is really what I realized was going on here. Manifestations of love and hate. Actually, I thought this was fascinating, can only, your colleague said, go back to love, really you can only win over hate with what? You can only win over hate, not just with love. It takes hard work too, and taquitos, and all that other stuff. But it really takes community. So I'm going to read you the very end, and then I'm hoping that you guys will ask questions and not be terrified of me. The character named Victor, after his mother dies, wants to be a music writer. He takes his SAT tests, which in America you have to go to college, right? And he has to memorize all these vocabulary words. But his mom is dead. He's really sad, and he's giving up. And who saves him is his 2 uncles. And they get him an apartment, and they get him a job, and he's watching cars in a parking lot. That's his job. But he's going to college, community college. And at night, once he realizes, on this very last page that I wrote by hand in a notebook, that he's going to be okay. Again, I thought he would hate his mom. Instead, he finally began to breathe once he was in the classroom. He loved the murmur of voices, the shoe soles on tile, the rustle of paper. And when class was over at 10, he walked across the parking lots of the college. Wilfredo was sitting on the edge of the stone wall, hunched into his jacket. It was Wilfredo's job to watch the cars when Victor was in class. Wilfredo is a new guy that's just shown up in the neighborhood, and he's from Belize. So, I'm sorry, but Wilfredo sounds like this. Wilfredo said to Victor, I tell you I'm not washing the cars. I only wash my own car when I get one. I'm going to get an Escalade, Black Midnight, okay? In that, I will get some thug love. Then Wilfredo stood up. He was 15, he hated his name, he hated his gold-edged teeth and his voice. He wanted to be an American. Wilfredo walked away toward the bus stop downtown. Wilfredo's mother, in Belize, had been drowned by one wave. Not even a storm, just one wave out of the blue. And Victor remembered that his grandfather was 7 when the Mississippi River flood took his own mother. And suddenly he thought, I had mine until last year. I had my mom. And he remembered the palm tree sparkler that she taught him. It was better than fireworks. She used to say to him when they were sitting on the balcony at the Riviera Apartments, "You could have it every month, baby. Just look. Every month, but winter is the best, because the moon is all clean. The winter moon like the rain washed it. Every moon's got a name. The old lady down in Louisiana told me. Hunter moon, harvest moon, the moon pulls all that water everywhere. And you always got a moon right here, and you always got a palm tree, baby. 3 palm trees. Can't nobody ever change that." He'd be sitting on her lap on that balcony, and she'd say, "The Riviera? You got a Riviera in France, but you got a Riviera right here." And she put her fingers like visors over his eyes to block out the apartment lights. And all Victor could see was the courtyard palm tree and the full moon behind it, and the way the fronds would toss in the wind, and their fringes would throw off silver fire like sparks. And that came from me taking out the trash at night and telling my 3 children to look up at the palm tree, and there was a full moon, and if you stand just at the right spot in dirty, dusty, hot Southern California, a place no one values where I live, and if you look up at the right time and the moon is behind the palm tree, it's like a giant electric sparkler with sparks flying off it. My kids never forgot that. All of those things together, to me, is how we make up story and we write fiction. So I thought I would end there. Thanks. Last thing, I wanted to read you a poem. Another one of my nephews. I do have to say, go back to, okay, so we have Jenny. The woman on the right is Daisy. That's the other side of our family. There are more stories that I'm not telling you. I just wanted you to see her. She's also very beautiful. This was my husband's grandmother, who was also descended from slaves. This is my mother-in-law, Alberta. I had to bring you this photo because now that in our family we're trying to document our history, this was a fragment, as you can see, of a photo. It's not even a full photo, and there are 4 daughters. Daisy herself had 4 beautiful daughters. And this one is my mother-in-law and her sister Rosie. My mother-in-law died when I was pregnant with Rosette, that last kid. And Rosette is my child that looks the most like her. So she only knows her grandmother from the stories we tell. And I thought, again, that's why I asked you, like, what stories do you hear? She always says, I'm the one that didn't ever know my real grandma, but I'm the one that looks the most like her. Anyway, I love this photo because don't they look like the Supremes? Like they're dressed up and they're going someplace really good, right? And then the next one. No, this one, just stop there for 1 second. I wanted to read you this poem at the very end. Another one of my nephews was killed in May, and I had emailed my sister-in-law and her grandson both died. And that's really hard, even in a big family like ours. And so I read this at his funeral. Because I'm the only writer in the family, my job is to always read poems at funerals. But I really thought that you would like this. This is the title of my new book. I'm not going to tell you about my new book. It's even darker and scarier and more horrible. And I just finished it, and it'll come out next year. We're not going to talk about it. It's set in 2019, and as the way our world is going right now, it's set on the border of California and Mexico. There are characters from Oaxaca, and there are still more of the descendants of Juanet, and there's deportation, and there's lots of other stuff. But the book is called The Love of Thousands. This is a Linda Hogan poem. She's a poet from Oklahoma, and that is where Fine, the original mother of everyone that I told you about, is buried. This is Linda Hogan, who's Chickasaw, Native American. Tonight I walk. I am watching the sky. I think of the people who came before me and how they knew the placement of the stars in the sky, watching the moving sun long and hard enough to witness how a certain angle of light touched a stone only once a year. Without written records, they knew the gods of every night, the small, fine details of the world around them, and the immensity above them. Sorry, now I'll be like you. My nephew who was killed was also a skateboarder, and he was killed on his skateboard, so. And he was only 20. I read this poem because all the skateboarders know every sidewalk and every tree and everywhere, and I thought this was perfect. Whichever road I